We started out the semester with the notionality that psychology takes us beyond biology, neurology, and the precursors to what Freud looked as neuroscience or genetics, into the idea of biopsychosocial. But from the perspective of biopsychology, we did not invalidate that science, because the neurology and the focus on genetics is still a valid construct associated with early psychology and neo-modern era psychology. So we're going to spend time talking about nature and nurture and how they work together in a complex puzzle. Because prior to Freud, Jung, Horner, the notion of biology as passed down intergenerationally was a construct that, was evolution, the science, or the theory of evolution proposed took millions or billions of years. But what we know based upon PET scans, in which we can see brain activity, neurological activity, we know that all experiences not only derive understandings and frame our personality, but many of them write back to our genetics. And even though those genetics may have not been passed down intergenerationally, they can then be passed down to the next generation. Or they become hardwired fixed thinking that affects our lives in positive ways until we decide we need to move past that construct. The whole notionality of the balance between paranoia and reasonable paranoia is just once a person experiences an event. We use the example of having their house broken into. Well, we might say it's unreasonable for them moving forward to check their locks 3 times, always, before feeling comfortable that the property is locked up. But that also may not be necessarily unreasonable in context with their prior experiences. And those prior experiences begin with infancy and are derived throughout childhood, just like all personality, from the point of inception. So we say the point that neurology begins is the point of fertilization. And then into the fetal stages, various neurological and biological developments happen. Until a full-term baby is born, there are points, like at 24 weeks, where that fetus can survive outside of the mother because the lung development, which is the one function necessary to survive, has usually fully developed at that 24-week period of time. And because advanced science allows us to keep an infant alive and through artificial feeding mechanisms or artificial breathing mechanisms, if that development is not necessarily sufficient in the fetal stages with the mother. Darwin proposed the theory of evolution, the notionality that all genetics were passed down over multi-millions and billions of years. It was largely considered to be scientific evidence and fact until Freud started to uncover the idea of the intrinsic self, the personality, in which we understand that personalities are so individual that it was impossible for them to be driven by these neurological sequences or genomes. Also, the separation between animals and people is the idea of the frontal lobe, in which brain development, cognitive capabilities, and the ability to question everything beyond fixed thinking is what separates people from the animal kingdom. So largely, the animal kingdom is without a frontal lobe processing or prefrontal cortex, and as such, just is relegated to fixed patterns of behavior and thought. Whereas, although it may seem difficult to question everything, we as humans have the ability to do so and reinforce our fixed thinking or decide it's time to move beyond it, given our safety, security, and comfort that we derived from relationships and then new experiences, which maybe invalidated the need to lock our doors 3 times. We moved into a new neighborhood, the crime rate is less an effect, we know the neighbors, and we became safe and secure and comfortable and no longer check the door 3 times to make sure it's locked. As an example, hundreds of thousands of other examples. Just an example. These genome sequences are part of our genetic material, our DNA. And the phenomes describe an individual's behavioral constructs, characteristics that those genetics defined. So largely, it is the case that our physical appearance is genetically driven and our phenotype is those observable characteristics. Now, there are unobservable characteristics that are recessive. So a person that has brown eyes may have a recessive trait for green or blue. And that would not be a phenome, but it's still a genome, larger set. The idea of recessive and primary traits are exemplified by this grid, in which, in this case, the father might have 2 recessive traits for a chin, cleft chin. The mother has 1 recessive and 1 dominant. And in literally all cases, you might expect that if there is a recessive trait for a smooth chin, that would overrule, because that recessive trait exists in all options. But the cleft chin is also potential to be the recessive trait, which is considered a potential in certain makeups of this set of possibilities. So in the case of the right-hand set of grids, where the only thing passed on is 2 recessive traits, the person will inherit only the recessive trait of a smooth chin. Even though, in this case, both the mother and the father have a dominant trait of a cleft chin, it is not necessarily always passed on in every possible mix. In this Punnett square, N represents a normal owl, and when we're saying owl, we're looking at trait. And P represents the recessive al, the recessive possibility that is associated with PKU. If two individuals mate and the then their associated trait is 25%, that they could have PKU, because the bottom right hand opportunity exists for that phenotype to migrate into this mix. So because of the bottom right-hand square, the existence of PKU has a 25% opportunity. Why doesn't it have greater? Because the capital N, the normal al, is dominant in 75% of the potential mating mix-ups. So our genotypes, phenotypes are written into chromosomes, and those chromosomes derive the development of our neurological structure. So everything comes from neurological development. Those of you that use the gym know that for the first 6 weeks of introducing new exercise, the outcome is strictly the neurological development, which then leads to, in 4 to 6 weeks, further muscular growth. The neurology has to come first in the developmental sequence. So the cell body, the axon, the cell membrane, and the dendrite are, most of these, we are born without the sheath. This myelin sheath is like an electrical wire, and it protects that wire. And as our neurons become myelinated, they become more and more permanent because they are protected from falling off as a result of a normal process, which is neurological pruning. So many of our neurological developments do not last because we do not reinforce them. So for instance, if you go to the gym once, you develop some neurons for the muscular strength potential that maybe your exercise developed. Maybe if you do not reinforce that, then those neurons don't become myelinated, and then through neurological pruning, which is just the natural process of getting rid of things that we don't need, the neuron development falls off. How does a neuron work? A neuron transmits information between multiple neurons. And so in this case, this is a neural transmitter. This neurotransmitter, if it was transmitting serotonin, which is the hormone that allows us to not be overwhelmed by annoyances in the environment. For instance, the sound of the air conditioning in the room. We're able to not gain anxiety and trauma from that distraction because serotonin allows us to negate some of the negative inputs. And in order to take advantage of that serotonin, our neurotransmitters have to transmit from one neuron to the receptors of another neuron in order to take advantage of the serotonin and activate the capacity to, in the case of serotonin, feel less overwhelmed. In the case of dopamine, to feel more self-efficacy and self-esteem. In the case of norepinephrine, to feel less pain, etc., all driven by our neurological and our nutritional profile. So how does this how does this potential happen? Well, it happens in a chemical exchange, sodium and potassium. The negative charge is derived by which means the switch is off, and the positive charge means the switch is on. And when the switch is on, the neurotransmitter will transmit to the next neuron over the synapses using electrical current. Hence, what a PET scan does is read those electrical currents and look at the particular influences and how does that affect the multiple millions of neurological sequences that are involved. So again, we have negatively charged proteins and positively charged proteins, which exist because of our nutritional makeup and the use of sodium and potassium to generate electricity. During action potential, the electrical charge across the membrane changes to potential state, meaning it derives the potential to generate electricity. That's in our action potential state. We're creating an electrical current, resting potential. Action potential is when our neurological system is generating electricity to jump the synapse. And then it goes into a repolarization and hyperpolarization stage in which it gets ready for the next neurological transaction. Now, many medications exploit various processes here in order to make adjustments. So when one takes a SSRI or an SSNI, an SSRI might be a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, we're affecting the repolarization and the hyperpolarization to leave the person in resting potential state more active and ready to reach full action potential. An SSNI only differs because it's affecting not only serotonin but norepinephrine as well. So here is an example of what the reuptake looks like. It just simply allows for more available neurological potential in the repolarization phase, leaving the person in repolarization in ready kinetic resting potential. The central nervous system is broken into multiple parts. The central nervous system is developed in pre-infancy and massively during pre-infancy and infancy into a full set of peripheral nervous systems. So other than the spinal cord and the brain, the peripheral nervous system allows for the functionality of all of our network of organs, in addition to our thinking processes. The parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are divisions of atomic nervous systems and have opposite effect. So the parasympathetic nervous system will constrict the pupils, slows the heart rate, constricts bronchial breathing, and allows for a calming effect, where the sympathetic nervous system will increase heart rate, increase breathing, decrease digestion so we can use our organ potential for fight, flight, or freeze. The surface of the brain is covered with tissue that allows for the brain to conduct its various functions. The various functions of the brain are handled in different ways with the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Scientists have dissected sheep to determine what the left brain and the right brain typically do. And all of us access both hemispheres. When a left brain person is highly dominant, then they're probably more of the analytical type of personality traits are going to come easier. A right brain person, the multidimensional, the comprehension of analysis of complex tasks. A left brain person might show up in one way on an IQ test, and a right brain person show up a different way. But in theory, there should be no difference in cognitive testing, even though the processing has strengths and weaknesses for each. The dissected brain also shows that there is a bridge between right brain and left brain, and hence why no one is purely left brain or purely right brain unless there's been damage to that bridge, the corpus callosum. So the brain and its parts are divided into three categories: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The hindbrain is the tip of the spinal cord, does rudimentary functionality. The midbrain does interim processing, decides fight, flight, or freeze, or to send data to the forebrain for further processing, in which we can take advantage of the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, and access what all animals have, which is memory that exists in the forebrain. Only humans generally access the prefrontal cortex and the prefrontal lobe in high efficacy ways like humans. So the lobes of the brain are the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Each of them have been studied over time to derive a variety of different functions. The coding is organized, so the cerebral cortex is the makeup of the four lobes of the brain, whereas the coding over the top of the brain is early ability to do kinetic functions. So the things that we need to be able to do instantly are controlled on the outer wrapping of the brain, like swallowing, chewing, movement, finger movement, eyebrows, facial expressions. There has been experiments that have been done over time to discern whether or not areas of the brain are responsible for different functionality. We do not have the brain mapped 100% or any high percentage way, although scientists like Dr. Daniel Amen, who have used PET scans, have advanced science significantly over the last 15 years in this way. The Wernicke's area handles language, the Broca's area as well, and damage there can affect one's ability to continue to process language effectively and learn new language skills. The thalamus serves as a relay center. So at the top of the spinal cord is the thalamus. And it is a relay center like a circuit box in which the wires are connected for routing of processing to the right aspects of the brain. The thalamus is highly protected and less susceptible to damage, but as you could see, if it were to be damaged, it would have a gigantic effect on processing. The limbic system is involved in mediating emotional response and memory. The hippocampus, the amygdala, the hippocampus all mitigate emotional response and memory. So after the thalamus is routing what needs to occur effectively, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus make determinations about short-term and long-term processing, mediating whether there's going to be an emotional response or going to memory and the prefrontal cortex for a long-term response, or both. The pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum make up the hindbrain. Rudimentary functionality. The neurological system is not standalone, of course, because it doesn't necessarily do anything on its own other than process data and communicate. The neurological system depends upon the musculoskeletal system, the endocrine system, the digestive system, and the other respiratory system, reproductive systems, in order for a comprehensive human functionality to exist. The primary influence of the neurological system is on the endocrine system. The endocrine system releases hormones and chemical interactions that stimulate other aspects of bodily function. So, for instance, the pineal gland is responsible for sleep. Sleep deprivation is a huge effect on neurological capacity, cognition, and development is dependent upon rest. And in fact, most neurological development occurs in the REM sleep. So the pineal gland, which is responsible for the production of melatonin and other chemicals that allow one to start to go to sleep in the afternoon and then ultimately be able to sleep for 16 and a half hours if you're an infant and 8 and a half hours if you are not, and somewhere in between as development occurs, is the driver, the mitigation and the driver between the neurological system and the other systems of the body through endocrine functionality. Another example would be the pituitary. The pituitary is responsible for stimulating the thyroid. Pituitary monitors the blood for TSH and then, monitors the blood for T3 and T4 and releases TSH to stimulate the thyroid in order to produce more T3 and T4, if necessary, to keep the organs running. The adrenal glands are stimulated by the endocrine system to release the effective hormones that allow for fight, flight, or freeze to be more than just a neurological response, but then to trigger a muscular skeletal response as a result. So all of the bodily systems in a person or in the animal kingdom are interconnected, but fully dependent on early infant and childhood development of the neurological systems.